I was 36 years old the week my grandfather's entire life, 40 years of sweat, sacrifice, and a Texas cattle ranch built from absolutely nothing, got handed over to a man who never once picked up a shovel on that land. My grandfather, Frank Calloway, died on a Monday. By Thursday, my father was standing on the front porch of the ranch house I'd grown up in, telling our whole family, in front of every cousin who'd driven in for the funeral, in front of the neighbors, in front of God himself, that I would not be inheriting a single acre. He said it smiling. He said it loud enough for people on the road to hear. Then he looked me dead in the eye like he'd already won. What my father never once stopped to consider was that I was the one who kept the books. And the books don't forget a thing. Welcome to Silent Revenge. I'm Morgan, and this is the story of how one quiet woman with a legal pad, a dead grandfather's accounting notebook, and a stranger who showed up at her door in the middle of the night took on her own father in a probate courtroom and walked out with everything. If you have ever been the one your family leans on but never lifts up, if you have ever been told to stay small when the truth was screaming to get out, pull up a chair. You are going to want to hear every word of this. Before any of this, before the forged signatures, the shell companies, the midnight envelope, and the courtroom that went so quiet you could hear people breathing, there was a ranch supply store outside of Amarillo, Texas, and a brass cowbell above the door, and the smell of feed dust and motor oil so thick it lived in your clothes. Callaway Feed and Farm Supply had been standing at the edge of Potter County since before I was born. My grandfather, Frank Callaway, built it with his own hands after coming home from Vietnam with nothing but a discharge paper and a stubbornness that time never quite wore down. He wasn't a showy man. He didn't drive expensive trucks or talk about himself at parties. What he did was show up every single day, unlock that door, and take care of people. Half the county ran on credit accounts at Frank's store at some point or another. Drought years, flood years, years when cattle prices cratered and families were stretched to the breaking point, Frank carried folks. He knew every family in that county by name. He knew their stories. And they knew his. I grew up behind that counter. I was 10 years old the first time my grandfather let me ring up a sale on the old register. I was 12 when he handed me a spiral-bound accounting notebook and told me the records were mine to keep now. He didn't look over my shoulder. He didn't correct me unless I asked. He just watched me get it right, and every time I got something right, he'd give this one slow nod that meant more to me than any grade I ever earned in school. People in our county owed Frank money for years at a stretch. He never chased a soul. But he always knew the exact figure down to the last dollar. One afternoon I asked him why he bothered writing everything down when he had it all memorized anyway. He set his coffee mug on the counter, looked at me for a long beat like he was deciding if I was old enough for a real answer, and then he said something I wrote on a piece of paper and kept in my desk for 20 years. The books don't forget, Morgan. But people sure do, especially when forgetting is convenient. I was 12. I thought it was one of those things old men say. I filed it away and kept writing, line after line, season after season, while my dad, Randy, stayed up at the house watching football and my uncle drifted off to Houston chasing money he never quite caught. For 24 years, that cowbell rang every morning, and I knew every sound that store made. Then Frank got sick in the spring of my 35th year. The store went quiet the way a house goes quiet when the one person holding it together starts to slip away. The accounting notebook went into a drawer. He passed that October. Peaceful, the hospice nurse said. Though nothing about it felt peaceful to the rest of us. 3 days after we buried him, a probate notice appeared in the county paper, and nothing about my family was ever the same again. The funeral was the kind that fills a church basement to the walls with casseroles and people who haven't seen each other in years. Frank had carried half this county on credit at one time or another, and half the county showed up to thank him for it. My father, Randy Callaway, worked that room like a politician the week before a close election. Shook every hand. Accepted every kind word. And somewhere between the potato salad and the third hour of small talk, he started using the word estate like it already had his name on the deed. I didn't pay it much attention that first day. Grief makes people grab for solid things. But by the next morning, Randy already had the keys to the ranch house, a lawyer's business card in his shirt pocket, and a tone I'd been hearing since childhood. The tone of a man who has already decided something and is just waiting for everyone else to figure out they lost. I found him in Frank's kitchen and asked the most natural question in the world. "When do we go over the will?" Randy didn't look up from his mug. "There's no will," he said, flat as pavement. "Pop never got around to making one." My stomach dropped. 'Cause I knew that was not true. 6 years back, not 2, not 3, but 6, I had driven Frank the 45 minutes out to a law office in Lubbock, Texas. A solo attorney named Gerald Pruitt, family law and estates, brick office with a Texas flag and a brass stand by the door. I'd sat in the waiting room with a magazine while Frank sat across from that lawyer and signed a thick stack of documents. A gray-haired woman stamped every page in sequence. When Frank came back out, he folded his glasses into his breast pocket, looked at me in that quiet way he had, and said, "Finally put my house in order." 6 years ago. I was 30 years old. I remembered it clearly. So I looked at my father across Frank's kitchen and I said it plainly. "Dad." I drove him there myself. 6 years ago. I was in the waiting room. I watched him sign. Randy set his mug down like he had all the time in the world. His jaw moved once. Then he said something I will carry in my chest for the rest of my life. Grief does funny things to a person's memory. And he walked out. The screen door swung shut behind him with a bang that sounded, in that moment, like a gavel. It blew up that Friday. The ranch house still had people drifting in and out from the burial. Cousins, old neighbors, a couple of Frank's friends from his army days who'd made the long drive to pay their respects. Randy gathered everyone on the front porch the way Frank used to gather the family for a summer cookout, except Frank did it because he loved people, and my father did it to hold court. He stood on the top step. Right where Frank always stood. He announced that since there was no will, he'd be petitioning the court to be named administrator of the entire estate. Said the law gave him full authority over all of it, the feed store, the land, the ranch house, every acre Frank had ever turned. Then his eyes found me standing at the bottom of the steps, and his mouth curved into something I had been watching my whole life without ever having a word for it. "You won't see a single cent of it," he said. "Dylan's the heir." Dylan. My younger brother. 29 years old, charming as the day is long, currently piecing himself back together after a landscaping company he'd sunk his savings into had folded 8 months earlier. He had a baby girl at home named Claire, a fist of credit card debt, and eyes that hadn't fully slept since the bankruptcy. Randy said it loud enough for the whole porch to hear. A few people laughed, that uncomfortable covering laugh people use when they want to be on the side that's winning and don't quite know yet who that is. I felt the heat rise up my neck. Dylan stared at the floorboards. I didn't argue. I think that threw them. I think they needed me to cry or shout so they could call me emotional and move on. Instead, I nodded like he'd just told me what the weather was doing, walked up those steps and past my father without looking at him, pushed through the front door I'd walked through 10,000 times in my life, picked my purse off the hall table and drove the 8 miles back to my apartment. And I did the only thing I've ever been good at when everything is falling apart. I started writing it all down. Here is what nobody in my family ever took the time to understand about me. They confused being quiet with being fine with things. For as long as I can remember, I was the one who handled the hard paperwork. When my mother passed, I filed the death certificates and tracked down the insurance policies. When Dylan totaled his truck at 22, I waded through the claims with him. When the store needed quarterly tax filings done, I drove out on Sunday mornings and did it for free without being asked because somebody had to. I told myself it was love. And mostly it was. But somewhere along the way, doing it without making a fuss turned into everyone assuming I would always do it without making a fuss and never wanting anything back. My whole life I had kept everyone else's accounts and never once put myself down as a creditor. Here is the other thing. I work as a paralegal. Probate and estates specifically. I I spend every single workday helping strangers untangle exactly the kind of mess my father was now trying to build. I had been so deep in the role of the good daughter that I'd almost talked myself into forgetting I knew precisely how this machinery worked, and precisely where it broke. Administrators don't simply get to keep everything. There are rules. There are duties. There are filings a court can demand and timelines a court can enforce. I poured a second cup of coffee I didn't need. Pulled out a legal pad. The top I wrote one word, the same way Frank taught me to start any account I couldn't yet balance. Questions. Underneath it, the first one. If there's genuinely no will, why is he acting like the owner instead of the manager? Monday I did what I tell every scared client sitting across from me to do first. I went straight to the source. Probate filings are public record in Texas. I drove to the Potter County Courthouse on my lunch break and pulled the case my father had already filed. And there it was in plain black type, Randy Calloway petitioning for appointment as independent administrator of the intestate estate of Frank L. Calloway. His attorney was a man named Dennis Vance. I knew that name from the wrong side of two cases at my firm. The petition listed the estate's assets the way you'd write a grocery list. The feed store appraised suspiciously low. 320 acres across 2 land parcels. The ranch house, outbuildings, farm equipment. Then it listed the heirs at law. Under Texas intestate succession, with Frank leaving no surviving spouse and Randy as his only living child, the entire estate passed directly to my father, not split, not shared. Dylan and I were Frank's grandchildren, but our connection to him ran through our father, and the law does not allow grandchildren to reach around a living parent to inherit. My father wasn't lying about the law. He was exactly right about it. If there truly was no will, the porch had been a legal fact. Either Frank died without writing one, or someone very much needed the whole family to believe he had. I copied every page and sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot and read the whole thing twice. Vance had moved with the kind of speed that grief does not usually allow, requesting that Randy be named sole administrator with independent authority and minimal court oversight. Less paperwork. Less accountability. Less distance between my father and everything Frank spent his life building. I closed the folder and said something out loud to nobody in particular. A manager doesn't act like an owner. So what exactly does he think he has? I wasn't going to show up at his door swinging. That is not how you fight someone who already has the keys in his pocket. You make him put things in writing. As an heir at law, I had a clear legal right to information about the estate's assets. So I drafted a formal request, a short professional letter to Dennis Vance asking for a full inventory of estate property and an accounting of every transaction since Frank's death. Certified mail, return receipt requested. Kept a copy of everything. I wasn't making accusations. Not yet. I was simply flipping on the lights. I mailed it on a Tuesday. My hands were shaking when I slid it through the slot. 4 days later, Vance's response arrived on firm letterhead. It was not an inventory. It was a warning. He wrote that my inquiries were distressing a grieving family, that the estate was in its earliest stages of administration, and that continued interference would be formally documented. No numbers. No asset list. Just a polished, lawyerly threat wrapped in sympathy language. I read it twice and set it down on my kitchen table. Something cold and very clear settled in my chest, the same feeling I get at work right before the pieces of a complicated case finally click into focus. People with nothing to hide produce the inventory. People who are hiding the inventory produce letters like this. Dylan showed up at my apartment that Saturday with a grocery store cherry pie and a look on his face like he hadn't slept a full night since the funeral. He'd always been the charmer in the family, quick with a smile, always one big plan away from everything working out. Now he had dark circles, a baby daughter, and the expression of a man who's been handed a script and is already not sure he believes it. He'd been sent. That much was obvious before he finished his second sentence. He told me Dad was just trying to keep the business in the family. that I was stirring up trouble out of bitterness, that Frank himself would have wanted a man in charge of things. He used the exact phrase, "You're tearing this family apart," which is a line that means absolutely nothing but always lands like a fist. He was using my father's words in my father's cadence, and I realized my little brother had turned into a recording of a man who had never once been generous to him without an angle attached. I didn't take the bait. I cut the pie. I asked how baby Claire was sleeping and watched him soften before catching himself, like warmth was something he'd been told to keep away from me. Then I slid the courthouse documents across the table and asked him one question. "Did you actually read what you signed, Dylan?" His fork stopped in midair. He looked at the papers, looked back at me, and for just a second one real crack showed through. "What do you mean, what I signed?" "Too quick. Way too quick." I pointed to the line on the petition where his signature sat, agreeing to support Randy's appointment as administrator, formally waiving his own right to object. His face went pale as the kitchen wall. He had not known. My father had walked my exhausted, cash-strapped little brother through a stack of legal documents the day after the funeral and said, "Standard procedure, son, just initial where I show you." And Dylan had done it because he was running on no sleep, a newborn, and the particular kind of trust that makes you sign things for your parents without reading them. That was the moment I stopped being only angry and started being precise. If you are the person in your family who always handles the hard paperwork, the one everyone leans on and no one thinks to protect, you know exactly what that moment feels like in your chest. Drop a comment below if this is hitting close to home. You are not alone at this table. The stalling continued in a pattern after that, and a pattern will tell you more than any direct answer. I wrote again, citing the specific Texas statute giving heirs the right to an accounting. Vance replied it was premature. I requested confirmation of when the inventory would be filed. He said the estate's matters were complex. Every response was professionally courteous and completely empty of information, and that emptiness was its own kind of answer. An administrator carries a fiduciary duty. That is not a suggestion. It means my father was legally required to act in every heir's best interests, to be honest, transparent, and accountable. A person with clean hands does not need to run the clock. So while Vance played stall games, I built something only I could build. 24 years of numbers lived in my memory. I sat down and reconstructed the store's financial picture from scratch, from old receipts I still had from doing the books, from county land tax records I pulled online, from what I knew about the cattle leases and the equipment inventory. I sketched out a working estimate of what the estate should reasonably contain. Then I held it next to what Randy had let slip on that porch: debts everywhere, a struggling business, barely enough to cover the funeral expenses. Two pictures did not come within a mile of each other. The man had painted a nearly empty estate. The numbers in my head described something in the range of $2 million. One version was a lie, and I knew which of them had been lying comfortably his whole life. I wrote my second question under the first. Where did it go? To answer that, I needed hard records, and I had exactly one set Randy couldn't reach. After Frank got sick, I'd brought home a folder of old receipts and land documents to help sort through his final tax filings. They'd been sitting untouched in my hall closet ever since. I spread everything across my kitchen table on a Sunday evening and let 24 years of memory do the work. And there it was. 2 land transfer deeds I had never entered into any record. Dated 5 months before Frank died, right in the deepest stretch of his illness, when he was on multiple medications and rarely leaving the house without help. 2 of the 3 land parcels from the Callaway Ranch quietly transferred from Frank Callaway to a limited liability company I had never once heard of. Lone Star Ridge Holdings. The sale price listed was a fraction of what that land was actually worth. I knew those acres. I had watched buyers compete for single parcels at county land auctions. The recorded price was less than a quarter of fair market value. But the price wasn't what stopped my breath. It was the signature. I had kept Frank's books for 24 years. I knew his handwriting the way you know someone's voice immediately without thinking. Frank signed with a heavy, deliberate loop on his capital F, a habit hammered into him by a schoolteacher back in 1962 who didn't accept sloppy penmanship from anyone. The F on these deeds was soft, hesitant. Pressure was wrong. The loop was shallow. And here is the thing that locked it in place. Frank's hands trembled by the time of his illness. A real, visible shake from the medication combination he was on. I had held those hands helping him to his doctor's appointments. I knew exactly how they moved. These signature lines were perfectly steady. The hand of someone performing a tremor rather than someone who actually had one. I sat back and let the kitchen go absolutely still around me. "That isn't his signature," I said to no one. Someone practiced his name and got it almost right. I pulled my laptop over and searched the Texas Secretary of State's business registry. Who owned Lone Star Ridge Holdings? Before I could finish pulling that thread, my father switched tactics on me. The threats hadn't worked. So he reached for the honey jar. He called on a Wednesday evening, voice all warmth, calling me kiddo for the first time in at least a decade. He said the family was fracturing and it was breaking his heart. He said Frank would be devastated to see his grandchildren fighting. He said maybe he hadn't communicated things the right way and he wanted to make it right. Then he got to the real point. He wanted me to sign a family settlement agreement. 1 page. I would release any claim against the estate and we'd all move forward together. Put the ugliness behind us. Heal the family. While he talked, I could hear my stepmother Diane in the background, feeding him lines in a low voice. Then she took the phone. "Think about Dylan's baby," she said, soft and deliberate. "You really want to drag a newborn's father into court over something that's already settled? For pride. There it is. The signature move. It is never hand over the money. It is always you're hurting an innocent child by asking questions. Guilt wrapped in a baby blanket and handed to you like a bomb. But I had spent 7 years watching this exact sequence run on grieving families in my office, and I knew exactly how to respond. You do not refuse outright and blow up a war you aren't ready to finish. You buy yourself time. I made my voice match his. Told him I needed a few days to go through anything I signed carefully. It was just how I was wired, nothing personal. He liked that. He took my caution for timidity, the same way he'd always taken my quietness for agreement. We ended the call almost pleasant. Then I set that unsigned page on my kitchen table right next to the deed with the forged signature and let myself sit for one still moment with the cold, clean feeling of a person being badly underestimated. The forged deed and the stalled accounting both pointed the same direction, but I needed the actual will to have any real case. And the will was nowhere. I remembered the lawyer, Gerald Pruitt, and the brick office in Lubbock with the Texas flag by the door. I made the 45-minute drive out there on a gray Saturday with a notebook on the passenger seat and more hope than I was letting myself acknowledge. The office was gone. A for lease sign in the window. A pile of old mail that nobody had collected in months pushed up against the door. I called the building management from the sidewalk. Pruitt had died of a heart attack 18 months earlier. Practice had shut down. Files had supposedly been sent to clients or handed off to a records storage service. Nobody could tell me which or where or whether Frank's files specifically had gone anywhere at all. I tried the County Bar Association, the records storage company, courthouse clerks. I left messages that went nowhere. I knocked on every door I could find and every one of them had been closed before I arrived. The law has a specific, merciless rule built for exactly this situation. When a will was last known to be in the person's own possession and cannot be located after death, the court presumes they destroyed it themselves, that they changed their mind and revoked it intentionally. My father would not need to confess to anything. The law would simply assume the will no longer existed, and the intestate petition would sail straight through. I drove the 45 minutes home in the dark, genuinely beaten for the first time in all of this. And when I pulled into my apartment parking lot, there was a woman standing in the cone of light beside my door. She wasn't moving. Just standing there. Patient. Maybe 70 years old, maybe a few years past that. A sensible winter coat. Posture of someone who had spent decades standing behind a professional counter. Not threatening. Not nervous. Just waiting, like she had decided she would stay there until I showed up regardless of how long it took. I got out of my car slowly, keys in my hand. "Are you Morgan?" she asked. "Frank Calloway's granddaughter, the one who kept his books?" The fact that she knew about the books, something I had never mentioned to any stranger in my life, made my feet stop moving. I told her I was. She said her name was Helen Garrett. For 28 years she had been the secretary and notary public for Gerald Pruitt. She'd read Frank's obituary in the county paper. Then she'd seen the probate filing notice, the one that announced his estate was being handled as though he had died without a will. She had lain awake 3 nights because she knew for a fact that was not true. She had watched Frank Calloway sign his will herself. She had stamped every page with her own seal. "Why come to me," I asked, "and not the court?" She looked at me with the steady eyes of a woman who had notarized 1,000 people's final wishes and had watched most of them honored and a few of them stolen. "The court didn't ask," she said simply. "Some truths need to be carried to the right person first." Then she reached into her coat pocket and produced a plain envelope, worn soft around the edges from being handled, and held it out to me under that parking lot light. I didn't open it right away. Somehow I understood that once I did, there was no closing it again. "Stay right here with me. 'Cause what's inside that envelope changes absolutely everything, and I mean everything." I brought Helen inside out of the cold. Made coffee with hands that would not quite stay still. Sat her at my kitchen table, and then I opened the envelope on the same table where I had been opening every hard truth for the past 2 months. 3 things came out. The first was a photocopy, a conformed copy of the last will and testament of Frank L. Calloway, dated 6 years prior. Every page initialed in his hand. Signatures clear and witnessed. I read it twice from top to bottom while Helen sipped her coffee and let me have the silence. Did not crown a single person with everything. The feed store and the ranch were left to be held jointly between Dylan and me, the 2 grandchildren who had actually worked beside Frank, who had carried his name and his ethic into adulthood. A fair cash portion was set aside for Randy, a son's share, a real amount, something substantial. But not the land. Not the store. Not the kingdom. My grandfather had loved his son enough to take care of him. And he had loved us enough not to let that son take everything else. The second item was a single photocopied page from a notary journal, Helen's own professional logbook. The date. The entry, last will and testament F.L. Calloway. Frank's signature. Her stamp. Her seal, recorded in sequence between 2 other documents she'd notarized the same afternoon. The third was a plain index card with a name and a phone number written in faded ballpoint. Chester Briggs. The second witness. Helen explained he had been a long-time hand at the Calloway Ranch who Frank had specifically asked to come to the signing that day. I sat at my table with that photocopy in my hands and understood something that had been forming for weeks without finding its words. Frank hadn't overlooked me. He hadn't written me off. He had seen every single year of keeping those books, and he had written it into the last official document of his life. Helen let me have a moment with that, and then she set down her mug and told me the part that put the weight straight back on my shoulders. "A copy isn't the will, honey," she said, quiet and direct. "The law will still presume he tore up the original himself. You'll have to prove he didn't. I can give you my testimony and my journal. I can't give you the rest. That part is yours to find." She stood up to leave. "You're the one who keeps the books," she said at the door. "So keep them." I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my legal pad and mapped the problem the way Frank taught me to work through an account that wouldn't balance. Turn it slowly, look at every angle, don't stop until something lines up. To get Frank's will admitted to probate, I would need to prove 3 distinct things to a judge. First, proper execution, meaning both witnesses, Helen and Chester, needed to be alive and willing to swear under oath to what they had seen. Second, the will's contents, which the conformed photocopy could establish page by page. Third, and hardest, I had to defeat the presumption of revocation. Court would assume Frank destroyed the original himself unless I could prove someone else had access to it and a reason to make it disappear. I had to put that original will in my father's hands in a way no judge could wave off. I wrote names in a column like ledger entries. Helen Garrett, execution confirmed, contents confirmed. Chester Briggs, execution to be confirmed. Lone Star Ridge Holdings, motive established. Access not yet proven. That last line was the wall. Without it, I had a strong suspicion dressed up in good paperwork. I needed a hard physical fact. I underlined Chester Briggs 3 times. He was the easiest piece to lose. An old ranch hand with a faded number, no forwarding address, could be anywhere or nowhere. He was the one I had to find first. The number on the index card rang to nothing, of course. So I did what paralegal work actually looks like most of the time, the slow, unglamorous process of locating a person who has simply moved on with his life and isn't expecting to be found. Public records searches. A skip trace through 2 dead ends. Cousin of a former co-worker who thought Chester had relocated to be near his daughter, maybe Oklahoma. A forwarding address in Tulsa that connected to a neighbor at a senior complex who had a more recent number. 9 days. More than a dozen calls. 3 tanks of gas and 1 overnight drive. I found Chester Briggs in a tidy little house on the outskirts of Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. He was 83 years old, sharp behind the eyes and careful on his feet, with a porch rocker and a weather vane shaped like a rooster spinning lazily over the garage. The moment I said Frank Calloway's name, something shifted in his face. "I'm not getting tangled up in family trouble," he said, hand on the screen door. I didn't push. Frank had shown me years ago that you don't push a stubborn man. You put the truth in front of him and let him decide what kind of person he wants to be. So I held up the conformed copy and Helen's notary page, standing right there on his front step, and I asked if he remembered that day. Chester took the papers in both hands. Read them slowly. Sat down in the porch rocker without seeming to notice he'd done it. And when he looked back up, his eyes were wet at the corners. "I remember it clear," he said. "Frank took us all to the barn door for lunch after. I had the chicken fried steak. He turned to look at me directly. He pointed through the window at the parking lot. Said his granddaughter was out there waiting. Said, 'That one right there, Morgan keeps the real books. She's the one who knows where everything actually stands.'" My throat closed up. I looked out at the field across the road for a long moment. Then I asked the only question that mattered. "If a court subpoenas you, Chester, will you show up?" He rocked once. Twice. Looked at the sky. "For Frank," he said finally. "I'll be there." Word moves fast in small Texas counties. Someone saw me leave town with a folder and come back lighter in the shoulders, and by the time I got home my father already knew I'd found something. He didn't call. He did something that took me more off guard. That Sunday he assembled the family at the ranch house, cousins, aunts, Diane's relatives, old neighbors, and he got his version of events in front of everyone before I could say a word. When I walked in through the back door, he was already deep into it, telling a kitchen full of people that I had invented a will, that I had found a desperate old woman willing to lie for me, that I had always been envious of the family's legacy and was now trying to steal it from my own grieving brother's family. He said it to people who had known me since I was 10 years old counting change at Frank's register. And the part that knocked the air out of me was watching a few of them believe him, because he said it with such complete, wounded certainty like he was the one being wronged. I felt the flush climb up from my collar. But underneath it I heard something, a sound from my memory. The old cowbell above the store door, ringing the way it rang when I was a kid and the day was just beginning. The sound that used to mean safety. I could have thrown the forged deed on the table right then. I could have announced everything I knew. But I would have been one woman raising her voice against one very confident man, and in that moment, in that kitchen, that is a fight you do not win. So I let the room go quiet. I picked up my bag. And I said the only thing worth saying, in a voice barely louder than the refrigerator's hum. Then you won't have any problem with the court taking a look. His face flickered. Just once. Just for a second. I walked out. And this time when the screen door latched behind me, it didn't sound like a closing. It sounded like a starting gun. Monday morning, I stopped being just a daughter and started being a petitioner. I hired a sharp probate attorney named Cassandra Reyes, who had sharp eyes and the kind of calm that comes from having won hard cases before. We filed two things at once. A petition to admit a lost will to probate, attaching the conformed copy, Helen's notary journal page, and Chester's sworn statement. And simultaneously, a motion to compel a complete accounting and asset inventory from Randy as administrator, the exact thing Vance had been dodging for weeks. Case was assigned to Judge Patricia Holden, a woman who had the expression of someone who had seen every variety of family deception roll through her courtroom and was not interested in being played by any of them. She granted the accounting motion at a short hearing and gave Randy 21 days to produce a full inventory and accounting of all estate transactions. I watched Vance's jaw go tight when she said it. Outside on the courthouse steps, Cassandra told me to brace myself. They'll contest the will hard. Presumption issue is real and judges take it seriously. But the accounting, that's where people like your father trip. You can conceal a document. It is much harder to conceal a financial trail once a judge is watching every transaction. I drove home that evening with the first genuinely clean feeling I'd had in 2 months. Not victory. I was nowhere near victory. But for the first time, my father was going to have to put his version of the numbers in writing. And I was the person in this story who knew exactly what to look for when the math doesn't add up. The accounting landed on the 21st day, a thick stack of pages that Vance clearly believed would bury the problems inside the volume. He had badly misjudged who would be sitting down to read it. I cleared my kitchen table, made a full pot of coffee, and opened it the way Frank opened the store every morning. Slow, deliberate, patient. Took me one evening to find the first problem. After that, they kept surfacing like things that had been held underwater too long. Lone Star Ridge Holdings appeared again, the same LLC from the forged deed. When I traced the registered agent through the state database, the paper chain ran through a single-member shell company directly back to Randy Calloway. My father had transferred estate land to an entity he personally owned and controlled, at roughly a third of what that land would fetch on the open market. He had moved property worth several $100,000 into his own pocket at the price of a decent used pickup truck. That is not a complicated gray area. That is textbook self-dealing, the single act a court-appointed administrator is most explicitly and absolutely forbidden to commit. Didn't end there. He had billed the estate administrative fees at 4 times anything a court would consider reasonable. He had charged Vance's legal bills to the estate for work that was clearly defending Randy personally rather than administering Frank's property. He had allowed the store's commercial insurance to lapse, leaving the entire building and its contents unprotected while he figured out what to do with it. Every entry was a small, dressed-up theft wearing the costume of responsible management. And I finally understood what the porch performance had really been. Dylan's the heir was never a plan to benefit my brother. It was a shield. If Randy had stood on those steps and announced that the land was going to him personally, even the most loyal cousins would have flinched. So he hid behind Dylan, a young dad with a newborn and mounting bills, because nobody wants to be the person who questions a grieving son trying to hold his family together. Dylan was never going to get the land. Dylan was the story Randy needed people to believe. The land was always meant for Lone Star Ridge Holdings, which was always Randy. I felt something settle and harden in me, but it wasn't rage. Rage is loud and burns itself out quickly. This was something quieter and more durable, the certainty you feel when a column you've been working on finally balances and you can see exactly what happened. I picked up a fresh legal pad. For every violation I wrote the entry, the applicable statute, the page number in Vance's filing. Building the exhibit that would walk into a courtroom and speak louder than anyone in that room. Dylan found me before I found him. He appeared at my apartment after dark on a Tuesday. No pie this time, no prepared speech. Just a man who had clearly not slept a full night since the porch, standing outside my door like he wasn't sure yet if he'd earned the right to come in. He sat on the steps instead of stepping inside. "I signed things, Morgan," he said to the parking lot. I didn't read them. Dad had this whole stack and he said it was just how the process works, just procedure, and I was so worn out and Claire had been up every 3 hours and I just signed wherever he showed me. He told me about the credit card debt and the failed business and the particular weight of owing your father something when you're already drowning. Randy had arrived with papers in hand the day after the funeral, while Dylan was at his lowest and had said, "Just help me get this sorted and I'll make sure your family is taken care of." My father had found the exact pressure point and leaned on it. But I had promised myself I would not soften just because the wound was understandable. So I went inside, brought out the accounting, and set it on the step between us under the porch light. I walked him through Lone Star Ridge. Showed him the land price that bore no relationship to actual market value. Showed him the lapsed insurance on the store we had both grown up in. Showed him what our father had actually done, not to me, not to the estate as a legal concept, but to the man who had taught both of us to ring that bell and show up every day. When Dylan looked up, his face had come completely apart. "If that's all real," he said, his voice not quite holding together, "then what does that make me?" I didn't rush to reassure him. Some reckonings a person has to sit inside for a minute before they can stand back up. "It makes you someone who got used," I told him. "Same as me. The only question left is what you do now that you know." I left him on that step with the numbers and let the night work on him. Randy's legal team didn't fold. They sharpened up and aimed straight at the weakest point in my case. Vance filed a motion to dismiss the will petition, built entirely around the presumption of revocation. His argument was clean and legally correct. No original will had been produced. Under Texas probate law, a will last known to be in the testator's possession that cannot be found after death is presumed to have been intentionally revoked by that person. A photocopy and 2 witnesses could establish what the will once said, but could not prove Frank hadn't simply torn it up himself before he died. Petition should be dismissed. Cassandra did not pretend this wasn't serious. "He's right about how the law works," she said. "We can prove the will existed. We can prove what it said. What we cannot yet put before a judge is how that original disappeared. We have motive. We have financial misconduct. We do not have access. We cannot place that original will in your father's hands. Without that link, Avery Morgan, we lose." I drove home with both hands on the wheel. Where would Frank have kept something that important? Not at a lawyer's office that no longer existed. Frank kept the things that mattered at home in the one place he had always kept them. And the moment I thought it, I knew exactly where, because I had watched him open it 100 times. The old floor safe in the back office off the kitchen. Bolted into the floor behind the desk where he paid the bills. That was where he kept the deeds, his discharge papers, the photograph of my grandmother the year they got married. If the original will was anywhere in the world, it had been in that safe. But the ranch house was Randy's territory now. I could not get near it. What I could get to was history. And small towns keep records whether they mean to or not. I started calling locksmiths. There are only a handful of licensed locksmiths in Potter County. The third one I reached remembered the job without a moment's hesitation, because you do not forget being called out to open a floor safe at a family ranch 3 weeks after a funeral. He had been hired to drill and replace the combination lock on an old built-in floor safe at the Callaway property outside Amarillo. Customer name on the work order was Randy Callaway. The service date was 11 days after Frank's funeral. 11 days. Long enough to mourn. Long enough to go through a dead man's desk, open a safe with a combination only Frank had ever known, find what was inside, decide you did not like what you found, and then call a locksmith to replace the lock so that no one could ever independently verify what had or hadn't been in there. I sat in my kitchen and let every piece lock into place. Frank kept the will in the safe. Randy was the only person with access to the property after Frank died. 11 days after the funeral, Randy changed the lock. He did not lose the will. He opened the safe, took out what was inside, and made sure no one else could ever look. I called Cassandra at 9:30 that night. She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she laughed, the tired, genuine laugh of someone who has just been handed the last piece of a puzzle they'd almost given up on. "That is your access," she said. "That is the presumption coming down." We had 3 weeks before the hearing. I worked those weeks the way Frank worked a harvest, every daylight hour and most of the dark ones. We subpoenaed the locksmith's work order, company's official business records, dated and signed by the technician who performed the job, showing the customer name and the service address. We secured Helen's original notary journal, the physical logbook, along with her full sworn affidavit. We confirmed Chester would make the drive from Oklahoma, and I called him twice a week to make sure he felt supported and knew exactly how much his willingness to come forward meant. Cassandra assembled the accounting violations into a clean, tabbed exhibit, statute beside entry, page number beside statute, organized so that a judge could follow the financial misconduct from first page to last without stopping to look anything up. And the night before the hearing, there was a knock at my door. Helen Garrett, standing on my step with a tin of shortbread cookies and one piece of advice she said she needed to deliver in person. "Say everything plain," she told me. "Don't reach for dramatic. Don't decorate it. Paperwork is doing the shouting. Your job is just to stand behind it." I wrote it at the top of my notes before I went to sleep. The Thursday morning hearing had drawn a crowd. Courthouse hallway smelled like industrial floor cleaner and old radiator heat, and it was full of family, aunts clustered on one bench, cousins who had not spoken to me since the porch refusing to make eye contact, neighbors who had known Frank for decades standing along the wall wanting to see how this landed. And there, near the courtroom doors, was Randy in his good charcoal suit with Dennis Vance at his shoulder, smooth, prepared, and satisfied in the way of men who have not yet realized the ground has shifted under them. My father had the posture of a person who still believed he was running this room. When he spotted me crossing the hall, he made sure the space between us was full of people. "Still chasing that fairy tale?" he said loud and easy. "You're not going to see a single cent." The exact words from the porch, said again like a man who had found a line that worked once and couldn't stop repeating it. A few heads turned. He smiled, satisfied. I didn't answer. I had a slim folder under one arm and Frank's original accounting notebook under the other, not as evidence, just as something of his to hold. Ballast, the way sailors used to load stone in the bottom of a ship to keep it from tipping. Dylan stood off by himself, separated from my father for the first time I could remember in years. Pale and standing very still in the way of a person who has not yet decided which side of a doorway they belong on. Cassandra touched my elbow. "Ready?" I looked at my father's comfortable face. The cousins he had persuaded. And my brother deciding who he was going to be. And the calm I had been building for 2 months, practicing the way you practice anything that matters, arrived without effort. Not numbness. Not resignation. Particular steadiness of a person who has checked their work and knows the numbers are right. "Let's go," I said. Judge Holden took the bench, surveyed the packed gallery with the expression of someone completely unsurprised by any of it, and called the case. "Let's hear from the petitioner." Helen Garrett went first. She took the stand in her good wool coat and Cassandra walked her through it at a careful, unhurried pace. 28 years as Gerald Pruitt's office secretary and notary public. The appointment 6 years ago when Frank Calloway came in to execute his will. Helen opened her original notary journal on the stand and read the entry aloud in her clear, precise voice. The date, the type of document, Frank's full name, her seal logged in sequence between two other instruments she had notarized the same afternoon. It was procedural, routine, completely ordinary office record-keeping, which was precisely what made it bulletproof. This was not a dramatic personal memory that a defense attorney could cloud with questions about the passage of time. This was a contemporaneous business record maintained by a licensed public officer in the ordinary course of her professional duties, the exact category of evidence that courts trust above almost any other. Vance rose to cross-examine. He suggested she couldn't possibly recall one specific signing among the thousands she had performed over 28 years. Helen looked at him with the steady patience of a woman who has been professionally underestimated before and has stopped finding it interesting. "I don't depend on recollection," she said. "I recorded it. That is the entire purpose of a notary journal." Vance tried another angle. Asked whether she could be certain the document logged was specifically a will and not some other instrument. "It says last will and testament," Helen said, tapping the page. "I wrote it. I don't abbreviate on my seal entries." He sat down. I watched the first Real crack appear in my father's expression. Cassandra thanked Helen and turned toward the gallery. "The petitioner calls Chester Briggs." The courtroom door opened and an 83-year-old man walked the length of the room slowly, steadily, under the eyes of every person in that space, half of whom had bought feed from him 20 years back and recognized him immediately. Chester Briggs swore his oath in a voice like gravel on a back road and gave the court what Helen's journal alone could not, the human weight of the day itself. He had worked the Callaway Ranch for nearly 20 years. Frank had called him personally and asked him to come to Lubbock as a signing witness. He remembered the lawyer's office, the documents, the formality of the occasion, and the lunch afterward at the Barn Door Steakhouse where Frank had talked openly about his intentions. The store and the ranch to his 2 grandchildren who had actually shown up every day. Cash portion for his son. He had wanted to make sure the people who had done the work would have the security to keep doing it. Then Cassandra asked whether Frank had said anything specific that day that had stayed with Chester over the years. Chester turned and looked straight at me in the gallery. "He pointed through the window at the parking lot," Chester said. "Told me his granddaughter was sitting out there waiting. Said, 'That girl right there has kept my books for 15 years and never once got a number wrong. She knows where everything really stands.'" The room went absolutely quiet. I looked at the ceiling for a moment and breathed. Vance attempted to challenge Chester on grounds of age and the reliability of long-term memory. Chester shrugged once, entirely unbothered. "Son, I'm 83. I'm slow on stairs and I can't read a menu without my glasses. But I know exactly what I witnessed, and I know what Frank told me at lunch that afternoon, and I have never in my life put my name on something I didn't mean. I came here because Frank trusted me once, and I don't see any reason to let him down over it now." Even Judge Holden permitted herself a brief, small smile. Then it was my turn. I took the stand with my folder and Frank's accounting notebook, and I did the one thing he had been teaching me since I was 12 years old, before I could have understood what it was worth. I let the paper do the talking first. The locksmith's work order, admitted into evidence and projected on the screen. Customer name, Randy Callaway. Service performed, drilling and replacing combination lock on built-in floor safe. Location, Callaway Ranch property, Amarillo, Texas. Date, 11 days after Frank Callaway's funeral. I explained in the flattest voice I had available that Frank had kept his most critical documents in that safe. That Randy was the only person with access to the property in the weeks after Frank's death. That there is one specific reason a person replaces the lock on a dead man's safe, and it is not to protect what's inside. It is to control who can ever check what used to be there. Then the Lone Star Ridge Holdings deed, along with the registry printout tracing the entity's sole membership back to Randy Callaway. Estate land sold to the administrator himself at a small fraction of its appraised value. Then the accounting page by quiet page. The inflated management fees. The lapsed store insurance. The legal invoices for Randy's personal defense charged directly against Frank's estate funds. I read each entry in the same even tone. No emotion in my voice. No adjectives. Just numbers, statute references, and page numbers. The gallery was perfectly still. When I had placed the last page down, I set Frank's accounting notebook on the rail in front of me. I looked at my father, not at the judge, not at the gallery. The man who had stood on a porch and told me I was worth nothing. "You told me once that the books don't forget," I said. "These are yours. This is the page you forgot you'd written." One full beat of silence. Then my father stood up. He came apart exactly the way I had known he would if I stayed calm enough long enough. Because the calmer I held, the worse everything he did looked by comparison. Vance put a hand on his arm. Randy shook it loose. He turned toward the gallery, toward the family, toward the cousins, toward everyone he had spent 2 months carefully managing. "She's distorting everything," he said, volume climbing. "She has always thought she was smarter than this family." "Mr. Calloway, please be seated," Judge Holden said, sharp and flat. He did not sit. That land was functionally mine anyway. I put years into that ranch while she sat inside playing with numbers. "Sit down, Mr. Calloway." But he was past the point where he could hear anything outside his own chest. All I did was correct what should have been set right in the first place. Pop had no business putting that girl ahead of his own son in his own will. The room went very still. In a courtroom. On the official record. In front of a judge, a court reporter, a bailiff, and every person in that county who had known Frank Calloway for 50 years, Randy Calloway had just announced that he had corrected a will he had been insisting for 2 months did not exist. You cannot argue a document never existed and in the same outburst rage that you fixed it. Both of those things cannot simultaneously be true. And he had said them both today in this room. Vance closed his eyes. Judge Holden let the silence run for exactly 1 deliberate beat. Then she ordered Randy into his seat in a voice that did not invite debate. The bailiff took a visible step forward. Randy sat down, chest still heaving, the full weight of what his own mouth had done beginning to settle over him. I had not said a single word through any of it. I had not needed to. My whole life I had been told my quiet was a weakness, a sign of submission, proof that I could be pushed around without consequence. In that courtroom on that Thursday morning, my quiet was the loudest thing in the room. Judge Holden looked out at the gallery and asked if anyone else present wished to be heard before she ruled. Dylan stood up. I think the standing surprised him as much as it surprised everyone around him. His voice was unsteady, but he did not sit back down. He identified himself, Randy's son, Frank's grandson, and he told the court that he had signed documents supporting his father's appointment without understanding what he was signing. He said he had been told it was routine paperwork, that he had been exhausted and frightened, and that he had trusted his father's word. He said he now believed the will was real. He said he did not want land that came through a forged signature and a replaced lock. He withdrew his support for Randy's administratorship on the official record and asked the court to honor what his grandfather had actually intended. That cost him something genuine, standing up against the only parent who had offered him anything when he was struggling. He did not look at me when he said it. He looked straight at the judge. But I understood. Some things you do because they're right and the looking comes later. Judge Holden took a 15-minute recess. She returned and ruled from the bench directly, the way judges who have made up their minds do. She found the will's proper execution proven by Helen Garrett's testimony and notary journal. She found the will's contents established by the conformed copy. She found the presumption of revocation defeated by clear and convincing evidence that the original had been within Randy Calloway's exclusive control after Frank's death, and that his documented conduct, the replaced lock, the financial self-dealing, the suppressed inventory, was entirely inconsistent with any innocent or accidental loss of the document. She admitted the last will and testament of Frank L. Calloway to probate. She removed Randy as administrator effective immediately. She ordered a full surcharge proceeding against Randy for the self-dealing land transfers and the excessive fees, meaning he would be required to restore the value he had taken. And she referred the forged deed and the concealed will to the county district attorney's office for review of potential criminal charges. She did not guarantee prosecution. The law does not move that fast or that predictably. But she opened the door. My grandfather's actual wishes were the law again. And the sound of that cowbell I had been hearing in the back of my head for months finally went quiet, because I no longer needed it to remind me who I was. The aftermath was quieter than anyone who watches too many movies would expect. That suited me completely. Frank's will was probated as he had written it. The store and the ranch came to Dylan and me jointly, the way Frank had always intended. Randy received the cash portion Frank had set aside for him, exactly that amount and not $1 more. The 2 land parcels he had moved to Lone Star Ridge Holdings came back into the estate under the surcharge order, and having to return that money hit him in the only place he had ever truly felt things. Dennis Vance is currently in discussions with the State Bar of Texas regarding the fees he billed and the ethical corners he cut. Last I heard, he was very motivated to resolve that matter as quietly as possible. The district attorney's review is still open. These things take time and they do not always end the way justice would prefer. But my father has learned at least this much, that a replace lock creates a work order, and some service records outlast the people who thought ordering them was a private matter. A few cousins called to apologize in the weeks after the ruling. I was gracious with every one of them. I have learned over time that you can hold someone accountable without needing to hold a grudge alongside it. Those are 2 entirely separate things, regardless of how loudly the people who wronged you try to convince you they're the same. I reopened Callaway Feed and Farm Supply on the first Saturday of December. I oiled the door hinges, swept the dust off the counter, and put the accounting notebook back in its place next to the register, exactly where Frank had always kept it. When I unlocked the front door and stepped through, the cowbell rang. And for the first time in almost a year, it sounded the way it used to when I was a little girl who had just been trusted with something real. Like coming home. Like being the person Frank always knew I was. Dylan runs the outdoor supply yard now, and he runs it well, steadier and more focused than I have ever seen him, like the crisis knocked something loose and the right thing settled into place when it did. But I set one boundary the morning we signed the partnership agreement, and I meant every syllable. The books stay honest, I told him. That's the only condition that doesn't have any flexibility. He didn't hesitate. He nodded the way you nod when something has always been true and you're finally saying it out loud. We are not the same family we were before any of this. Dylan and I are something smaller in number and more deliberate in trust. The door between us is open, but it has a lock now, and we both know where it is and what it takes to earn the key. Frank was right about the only thing that ever really counted. The books don't lie. The records don't forget. And the people who spend their lives maintaining both of those things deserve to be treated like the asset they are. It took me 36 years and one stolen estate to understand something that was true about me the entire time. Being the quiet one in the family, the one who handles things, reads things, files things, shows up without being asked, was never once the same as being the one without power. It was just the one with the most accurate information. That's my story. One smirk at a graveside. One stranger in a parking lot with an envelope. One accounting notebook read out loud in a room full of people who finally had to listen. If this story reminded you to find out where the will actually is, go find out. Today. Not next month. Today. If it reminded you to read what someone is asking you to sign before you sign it, do that too. People who want you to skip that step are always the people with something to hide. And if you know someone in your life who is always the quiet one, the one who does the hard work and never asks for credit, share this with them. 'Cause quiet people are not waiting to be rescued. They're just waiting for someone to hand them the microphone. This is silent revenge. If this story hit home, subscribe and come back for the next one. Drop a comment and tell me, are you the one in your family who keeps the books? I want to hear from you.